Hello, I'm Richard Folland. I'm the Policy and Government Affairs Advisor for the Carbon Tracker Initiative, the London-based financial think tank, and a warm welcome to what I'm sure is going to be a very interesting session on what data should be made transparent in climate disclosures. Our starting point for this discussion is looking at when companies publish more transparent climate-related disclosures, is that ought to help make markets more efficient and economies more stable. So the sort of questions we're going to be addressing in this session are: how can companies be encouraged to provide comprehensive, quality and transparent climate-related disclosures so investors can accurately assess risk? What are the most important types of information that should be disclosed? What is the right data to work towards? And how do you effectively compare sectors? What are investors doing to assist companies in providing them the data that they need? And how can company employees be encouraged to report on ESG metrics as part of their day-to-day work? So, to help give us the answers to those questions, we've got a great expert panel assembled in front of you. We have Olivia Titchett of Musim Mas Group. We have Martin Skanker. And Martin is both the chair of the Risk Committee for Storebrand and also the chair of the Principles for Responsible Investment. We have Sebastian Steinhauser. Sebastian is the Chief Strategy Officer for SAP. And we have Harriet Howie. And Harriet is the Global Lead for Non-Financial Reporting and ESG at Diageo. So I'm just going to briefly run through the structure for the next 35 minutes. I'm going to turn to each of the panelists with an opening question relevant to our subject matter. Then after that initial round, I'm going to turn back to them, each in turn again, for questions which goes into some more detail on the topic. And hopefully you're going to get some differing perspectives and angles, and we're going to have a relaxed, free-flowing discussion, which I hope is going to leave you stimulated, informed on this topic of data and climate disclosures and when we began this session. So I hope that's all clear. And so let me turn to the panel, and I'm going to go to Olivia first. So Olivia, your sector, you work in agricultural supply chains, where Scope 3 emissions are mostly covered by small farmers. Could you say to us how transparency is meaningful to support action to reduce emissions in the sector?
Well, thank you, Richard. So, Musimas is a palm oil company, so we're integrated from upstream to downstream, and a lot of our supply comes from third parties, and a lot of those are small farmers. And the small farmers sell to primary processors, who then sell to us, and we process further, and so on and so forth. So, we have obviously a need to know as much as we can, to assess as much as we can our Scope 3 emissions, and that's small farmers. Problem is, we have on a year, we have about 800, 900, maybe up to 1 million smallholders in our supply chain. And from year to year, they're not the same ones. So transparency is critical for us to know where are the emissions, what are the emissions we want to know, but the goal is not so much a transparency in as much as getting the perfect data, but in as much as to get the perfect emissions. I think that to us is the main point. Transparency is not the end game. Reducing the emissions is the end game. So how do we manage to still be transparent enough that we can have credibility and foster trust by being transparent, and at the same time not pursue the perfection which will actually be contrary to our own goals? So how do we not run behind the train, so to speak? That is the difficulty, I think, in agriculture. So we believe that it's a matter of perfecting the system. How do we first use maybe coarse proxies to gain a rough knowledge of what the emissions are, and then we can perfect that by getting by clearer and clearer proxies, knowing that we will not have in real time the emissions numbers from our supply chain. So how do we work around that so that we can assess at best the emissions, not only know where they happen, but if we can, so to speak, develop models of smallholders, types of smallholders, of small farmers, and see how then we can make sense of that and then develop actions to see how we can reduce those emissions. That is the difficulty, how to still maintain trust while admitting that we will not
Okay.
have that perfect transparency.
Okay, Olivia, thanks very much. That's very clear. You've spelled out well there the end game, as you put it. Martin, can I turn to you now, please? And from your perspective, what types of disclosure on climate are investors looking to, and how is the information being used by them?
Well, thank you, Richard. So yes, as you said, I'm the chair of the Principles for Responsible Investment, and we're a coalition of institutional investors working on responsible investment issues. We now have about 5,000 signatory institutions in 70 or 80 different countries. So I come to this very much from the perspective of, let's say, an institutional investor. I'm also on the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, and so been working a lot on these disclosures. And I think a useful starting point from an investor perspective, I think, is thinking about the role that investors have in a market economy. So in a market economy, it's the financial sector, either institutional investors providing equity, bond finance, or banks providing loans, that determine which companies get financing and which don't, basically. And we all know that we need to make the transition to a green economy, but we don't know the extent to which that transformation will happen through a transformation of existing companies or building down existing companies and building up new ones. And it will probably be a mix of both. Some companies will be able to transform themselves and make money in a low carbon economy, and others will struggle with that. And I think, just think of different sectors, like we're now seeing, a huge growth in electric vehicles. And will the car companies of the future be today's producers of fossil fuel cars that have managed to transform themselves? Or will newcomers like Tesla and others outcompete them? And for investors, this is a crucial question because they need to make an informed decision about which companies they should be providing financing to and which companies where they should be withholding financing. And in practice, that means putting pressure on companies with unsustainable business models to cut back on investments and return more capital in the form of dividends to their owners so that the owners can reinvest in business models that make more sense in the transition to a low carbon economy. So I think starting with that as, starting from the role of the investors, I think is a useful point of departure for discussing what kind of disclosures do you need to make that informed decision. And so that really covers a whole range of things, and most of them are covered in the TCFD framework. But it's things like companies' exposure to physical risk, transition risks, and opportunities, not least, because it's not only risk, it's also lots of business opportunities. Climate-related targets, how those targets will be achieved, emissions, obviously, but also crucially, not just quantitative data points, but also more qualitative information to contextualize the data in terms of thinking about things like governance, risk management, strategy, understanding how companies are working on this. The first question in the TCFD framework is describe the board's oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities. It's a very sort of qualitative question. But I think the very simple thinking behind that question is, if a company doesn't even have this on their agenda, it's very unlikely that they will be able to transform themselves. So having boards discuss climate risk as part of their strategy process is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for a company to make a successful transformation. And so that's qualitative information about how climate risks and opportunities are embedded in the strategy process. And I think that's what investors in the end are looking for. They're looking for these kinds of metrics that can tell them something about whether a particular company is likely to be able to transform itself and make money in a low carbon economy. And all of these different data needs, I think, should be seen in that context.
Martin, that's great. Thank you. Very comprehensive there on the types of disclosures, I think. So, Sebastian, I'm going to turn to you now with a data question. The ESG world is under fire because companies often provide disclosures that are inaccurate or incomplete. But there's so much technology and data available. Why is that the case?
Thanks, Richard. And maybe I'm Sebastian. I'm Chief Strategy Officer at SAP and also lead our sustainability initiatives. And as some of you might know, at SAP, we touch almost 90% of the global financial and goods flows with our enterprise software. And with that, also the lion's share of global emissions data at some point touches our system. Now, I would say, look, the good thing I'm hearing when I talk to CFOs, chief sustainability officers, CEOs around the world is there's not anymore a question of why should we share ESG data? Why should we set ambitious targets? What should be our targets? What are the main levers? I think the main question I'm getting is how to get it done, based on transparent, reliable data. And typically what I'm hearing is one of three challenges that are all related to data. First is how to record what I call actual instead of average data, because right now most, especially ESG disclosures around emissions are based on industry average emission factors, and you want to move towards actual data being shared throughout value chains from, say, Olivier as a palm oil supplier all the way to the end consumer product. Second, then, is record. I think many CFOs are very nervous right now about the increasing amount of regulatory requirements they will have to report against in 2023 with the upcoming SEC regulation, EU taxonomy. And I think many have seen how hard it is actually to estimate, especially scope 3 data in an accurate way. I think even without any malintent, it's really easy right now if you go with an industry average to get it wrong by a significant factor, because if you think about, say, a ton of aluminum, the global average might be, 16 tons of CO2 per ton of aluminum, but there are huge differences between which plant is it coming from, what's the grade of material that has been used, and so on and so on. So it's really the record piece is the second major challenges. And then the third, and I think to me the most important one, is how to act. And with act, I mean not like having a singular sustainability initiative, but embed sustainability and with that ESG data into every business process, your entire value chain, and ultimately your business model. So that's really, to me, it's encouraging overall to see we moved from why and what to actually how to get it done. And there is a big data transparency challenge to be solved. And I think it's not only a problem that data is not available. It's really to agree on common methodologies, to set common frameworks that we all agree on, because that's the main inhibitor right now. First, getting the data cleaned up in your ERP system, but then also having aligned methodologies that you can share throughout entire value chains that can be incredibly complex, that everybody uses a similar calculation methodology that is then absolutely comparable also, as Martin, you mentioned, towards investors.
Thanks, Sebastian, very much. I may come back to you more on that act and embed point, perhaps to elaborate. But let me bring Harriet in now. And Harriet, I've got an open-ended question for you, really, which is, what is Diageo's approach to ESG reporting?
Yeah, an open-ended question with an almost endless answer. it's a very complicated area, and it's been so interesting to hear the rest of the panel's views on, particularly climate change risk reporting and some of the challenges that face companies like Diageo. As most of the people I'm sure will know that are watching this session, Diageo is a global beverage alcohol company. We have around 200 brands which we sell across 180 countries. We have a very big global footprint, and that means that our sustainability and ESG reporting is by its very definition quite complex. But we do see the reporting of our ESG performance and commitments as incredibly important. And with that in mind, we publish a fully integrated annual report. What that means is we publish all of our non-financial performance alongside our financial performance in our annual report and in an addendum to the annual report, which is available on our website. And that addendum includes our GRI aligned disclosures, so with a real focus on stakeholder materiality, a SASB aligned set of disclosures, so a real focus on enterprise value creation materiality. And also within our annual report itself, we provide disclosures around our 25 quantitative targets, which form our Society 2030 Spirit of Progress ambition, which is an ambition to really address our most material ESG issues within our company, for communities and for broader society as well. And of course, no annual report would be complete without a TCFD disclosure, so a disclosure which outlines our climate change risks and opportunities and how we've analysed those and what that means for us as an organisation in terms of the action that we're taking in this area. So we think it's really, really important for companies to provide robust, transparent and timely reporting on their most material ESG issues. We have a bit of a view that this information should be provided at the same time as financial disclosures. The two things should not be seen in isolation. And arguably, reporting on your most material ESG issues, which should, of course, for all companies include climate change risk, is really part of your fiduciary duty as a company and as an issuer. So we don't have all of the answers when it comes to reporting, and I thought Sebastian really, really neatly summarised some of the major challenges facing organisations in this area. But what we do have is a real commitment to acting on these topics and also making progress every year that we report. We learn a huge amount each year, and we're really committed to acting upon those learnings in the spirit of a continuous improvement in the reports that we publish.
Thanks, Harriet. Well, it could have been endless, but it wasn't, and you managed to distill very well there, I think, into what you do. And maybe if you can hold that thought to come back on, on the point that Sebastian was making about where maybe improvements could be made. But Olivia, I'm going to turn back to you now, if I may. And you were very clear in your opening answer there about transparency being the end goal, really being about emissions reduction. But I wonder, could you say a little bit more about the methods? What are the models you can use in terms of improving transparency in the sector that you're operating in on, emissions and climate-related disclosures? Thank you.
Well, without going into details, I would say that there's, I think, what Sebastian mentioned earlier on having common models or common reportings, common aggregators in our industry. Like Sebastian mentioned as well, we are upstream and we have to pass some information all the way downstream and, if possible, all the way to the customer. The customer is far removed from us. So it's about how we can aggregate data. And I would think that it's not only a matter of the methods that we are using to calculate the emissions or to assess this impact or this risk or that risk. It's also afterwards how we can pass it in a trusted manner. And so beyond the methodologies, which can be either our own or which can be methodologies that we take from common groups or groups where you have multi-stakeholder participation, where we determine how to best share information. What is important then as well is the verification. How do we pass on things in a verified manner, in a way that fosters trust? Why do I say that? Because, as I mentioned, we are aggregating a lot of data. Some of that data might be considered private data. So we have complexities in our supply chain where you have a lot of actors. Some might be perfectly happy sharing data and seeing being published. Some might not be happy, and they might be at the same level. So that poses some interesting governance issues for us, and we pose it downstream to our customers, and we hope it goes all the way to the actual customer at the end, who's using the product and who should think, what information am I gathering? Would I be happy to also share information? But then that should not prevent us from working. So how do we then aggregate, and how do we share without sharing? How do we make it so that we can do that in a way that is trusted? And I believe there's a strong point to be made for verification. How do we, at certain stages in the processing, if you want, verify that the methods that we've been using are not only sound, which might be the job of, like I said, multi-stakeholder initiatives, but then have we been using those methods in the correct way? And so can the results that we show, which are aggregated, can they be trusted? And so can we pass that value further down the chain in a way that will be trusted by the customers, but also indeed by the financial sector? I'll just make a footnote here. We are not a listed company, so we're a private company. And yet, the one thing that we publish every year, which is externally verified, is our sustainability report. We believe that's very important information. We also believe that as a private company, we should not say, well, this is like financial information, we should keep it under wraps. We believe that is a bit competitive, but not entirely competitive, and that it should be shared, and most important, that it should be verified so that there can be trust. And in particular, in our sector, we need to build that trust and to maintain that trust. I hope that was not too convoluted, but like I said, methodologies can be common, but the verification, I think, is a very important point on how we pass then on the values down or across, for that matter, the supply chain, the value chain.
No, Olivier, that was not convoluted. It was very clear. And also, I think you teed that well for us to bring Martin back into the discussion from a finance and investment point of view. And Martin, you talked earlier about the types of disclosures that investors are looking for. Could you say a little bit, this word that came up earlier, improvement? How are investors, working to improve reporting from the companies which they invest in?
So I think there are maybe three main strategies here. So one is, of course, investors are engaging directly with companies on these issues. They are doing that individually, and they are doing this collaboratively through things like the so-called Climate Action 100 Plus initiative, where basically investors come together and engage with some of the largest emitters in the industrial sector, for instance. So, but we also see that other investors are publishing expectations that they have of companies and their reporting, and they bring this up in discussions with the companies they've invested in. So that's one important sort of aspect and one important strategy of this. Secondly, I think investors are trying to cooperate on understanding and utilizing this data. We have initiatives like the Net Zero Asset Owner Initiative and the Net Zero Asset Manager Initiative. So those are initiatives that recognize that the financial institutions themselves have important stakeholders, beneficiaries, for instance, that expect reporting on how exposed their portfolios are to climate-related risks. And so there is a lot of cooperation now between investors on these methodological issues of how to measure climate risk on a portfolio and how to report that in a good way. And also how do you sort of go from understanding climate-related risks and opportunities at the individual company level to understanding it at the portfolio level. So there is a lot of work going on between investors and in the investor community on those issues. And then the third main area is how investors engage with regulators, policymakers, standard setters. And I mentioned the work that I've been engaged in, and the PRI has been engaged with a so-called TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. I think now a really important work is being done by the so-called ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board. So lots of acronyms, obviously, in this sector. So this is basically a new institution under the IFRS umbrella, making sustainability standards. And they have issued 2 draft standards, one general standard for sustainability and one climate-specific draft standard, which builds on the TCFD and the TCFD approach. And I think in many ways will, over time, maybe become a successor to the TCFD. And I think building on Harriet's point, it's clearly been the intention from the for the TCFD, and I think also for these new ISSB standards, that they will be part of financial disclosure. And speaking as a member of a risk committee and an audit committee in a listed company, whenever something is part of your financial filings, it means it goes through a whole process with the auditors, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it gives a whole different level of verification once you include it in your financial filings. So that's sort of the third area, is really making sure that these standards develop in a way that make them useful for investors. And the ISSB has set up an investor sort of panel or reference group to make sure that the investor voice is heard when these standards are developed. And I think that will be a really important arena for investors going forward, to make sure that these ISSB standards are fit for purpose and that they answer to the needs of investors.
Thanks, Martin. So that standard setting sounds extremely important, but also helpful. You talked about the engagement and the value of the sort of the different investor coalitions as well. So Sebastian, if I could bring you back in now, please, and where you talked about the importance of embedding sustainability, ESG data in core business processes. Perhaps could you elaborate on that, please, and ways in which you think that work can be taken forward to improve overall reporting?
No, absolutely. And I think, look, in the end, it's like Olivier said, I mean, we can report all we want, but we ultimately need to act to really to reduce the actual risk. And I think in the past, I've spoken to customers and partners that felt, well, there's this like one or two levers. If I just get green hydrogen, or if I just manage to get solar and green energy, then I'm done. And I think now the realization is becoming more and more that you will not have a sustainability transformation separate from your business transformation, but you will transform your business with sustainability as a key business principle in mind. And I say that because if you think about it, I mean, let's say you're an automotive company. I mean, everything you do is then related to sustainability, because you want to, your main emissions are like 70-80% in scope 3. So it's in the way how you procure from your suppliers. It's in the way how your customers ultimately use the product, that you recycle the product. It's in the way how you manufacture the product. It's in the way how you can reduce the energy intensity in the manufacturing process. And that even then expands to back office processes that you need to adjust, because you need to do different production planning, you need to hire for different skills. So I would argue really designing your business with sustainability in mind and transforming your business with sustainability in mind is a holistic transformation that cannot be a separate initiative, but really needs to be embedded in the company strategy and the company transformation agenda.
Thank you, Sebastian. Very good advice, I think, there. And again, coming back to that point about embedding and, within the sort of the overall company strategy. So Harriet, you described earlier the really quite comprehensive, reporting that Diageo is doing now, with around ESG and climate. But you also said, things can always be improved. Any thoughts there, suggestions on how the reporting process could be improved as far as you're concerned?
Oh, I have lots. But I think building on what Martin said, like one thing that companies really need is consolidation of the standards that apply to them as a global organization. Diageo is listed in the UK and in the US. We have a number of other subsidiary listings. And it is really challenging to assess the standards that we're going to be subject to in both the UK, in the EU, and in the US. I think that through the TCFD, there's been some amazing work done on consolidation of standards for climate change risk reporting. And I would just really encourage all governments to be very supportive of the work of the International Sustainability Standards Board, particularly as that as those standards are adopted into legislation in different jurisdictions, it would be great if different geographies could work together to make sure that they adopt them into legislation in a very similar way to reduce the reporting burden on companies. Companies want to do good reporting, not least because, as quite rightly, as Sebastian said, it's not just about reporting, it's actually about action. And it is an aphorism, it's a cliche, but what you measure, you manage. And if you have a good set of reporting standards on these really important ESG issues, then you have a blueprint for management of things which are likely to be highly material to your organization. And that's the way that companies should be looking at this. They should be looking at this as a helpful map for how they tackle some of these really complex and entrenched environmental and social issues within their organization. TCFD gives you a list of 11 things across 4 kind of pillars that you need to be thinking about. And once you start applying that reporting to the work that you do, it's very hard not to embed good governance of climate change risk and really material action, because otherwise you actually don't have much to say under that framework. You're really going to have a very sparse disclosure unless you actually take action. So I think for us, what we want to see is like a real effort for standardization and consolidation of reporting frameworks, really good engagement with companies and investors on kind of what's practicable and also what's useful and necessary in terms of decision making, and a continuous commitment to improvement. So I would encourage all companies, if you're considering how you need to approach this challenge, is to really have a bias for action and to start somewhere and acknowledge that you don't have all of the answers and that you intend to build and improve. And I think that's the approach that we've taken as an organization, and it has served us very well. And I'm really proud of the fact that in 3 years we've gone from a fairly basic TCFD disclosure to something that is very granular, has a lot of specificity, and is hopefully something that our investors can read and find useful and take comfort from the fact that climate change risk is obviously an issue that we are assessing and modelling as part of our broader strategic thinking. And I think just finally, I can't overstate the importance of building in ESG into all of your core business processes, as already been mentioned on this panel. It's absolutely impossible to be successful in this area without doing that. It's really important to layer it into things like, for example, CapEx decisions. If you've got a big capital expenditure program, you need to make sure it is supporting your sustainability efforts and not inadvertently going to be somehow impacting them negatively. And once you start joining up that sort of thinking across the organization, you can really, really make an impact on how you're tackling some of these issues. And the final point that I would add, which is something I feel super passionate about, is that these issues are issues of innovation, and companies are really good innovators. Companies have been innovating for as long as they've existed to solve complex challenges across a whole range of industries. Nobody should be seeing the transition to a low carbon economy as anything else than an innovation challenge. And with innovation comes mitigation of risk, obviously, but also maximization of opportunity. And not only is that the right thing to do for society and the planet, and it's absolutely critical that we take action in this area as a global society, because we need to, and we saw at COP26 that there was a huge amount further to go. And I have very high hopes for COP27 in some really bold commitments coming out of that, that COP. But it's just it's an innovation challenge, and companies need to be thinking about it in that respect.
Thanks, Harriet, and thank you for finishing on that optimistic note. I think, Martin, did you want to come in quickly on this?
I just thought, well, I'm super inspired by Harriet here, and as a member of the TCFD, I'm really, really happy to hear that this is a useful framework. And I wanted to stress one particular point, because that's important that when people talk about reporting, they think that the objective of the reporting framework is to produce the report. But that's not really how I see the TCFD. It's not about producing the glossy TCFD report. it's about the process, as Harriet says. And I think it's actually about two processes. It's about one internal process where you can use this as a framework to structure how you embed climate risk and opportunities in your strategy and risk management processes. So that's sort of the internal use of it. And then there's an external use of it, which is how you structure, how you communicate to your shareholders and other stakeholders around your work on climate, and in particular on the robustness, the resilience of your business model in this transition to a low carbon economy. So I think thinking about this more as processes rather than thinking that the TCFD and other reporting frameworks are about producing the report. I think that's a huge step forward, and I think Harriet really explained very well how they do that.
Well, and Martin, thank you for that reminder as well. So, yeah, Olivia, absolutely. I will bring you in, and then Sebastian, and I think we will pretty well have to draw things to a close here. But Olivia, please come in.
Thank you. I would like to thank Harriet for. I will not disagree with her anyway, so I'd like to thank her for what she said. Very convincing. And like Martin, I also agree that the point of using the TCFD is not only about the glossy report, and that's definitely not the point. It's actually about how internally we can assess better and express better and review better what we considered were the risks for the company and how our company is fit to be still there in a couple of years and hopefully for quite some time profitably. That, I think, is something that has sometimes stirred a little bit some companies because they would think, oh, but our financials are very strong. Yes, but you should not only consider that as the strength of your company. That will not make your company relevant. And in particular in agriculture, I think we're very, very sensitive to this. Actually, we should look at other risks and how we mitigate them and how we are ready for them and how they will impact our business and how we demonstrate that we will still be a profitable company, a relevant company in the years to come. So yes, TCFD, it's been very useful, a bit confusing at the beginning, but very useful, I think, for companies, including private companies.
Olivia, thank you very much. So, Sebastian, I'm going to give you the last word on the panel here. I mean, certain themes have come through quite strongly, I think, around, it's not just about the report, but thinking about ultimately what you're looking to achieve here. And there's something here which I've heard about the sort of the pragmatic approach and don't let perfection be the enemy of the good on this. But any reflections that you would like to conclude on, please?
I can just, I really would love to conclude on a note of optimism, because I mean, it's super easy these days to get pessimistic. But I think if I listen to Harriet, Martin, and Olivier, I think there's so much common ground and agreement around how the importance of disclosures, the openness I hear from especially CFOs around the world, and the actually ask for, hey, let's do more, let's collaborate more, let's work together. That really gives me a lot of reason for optimism, because to me, ultimately, and that's what I makes me very positive, is sustainability is a team sport. It's very different from typical conversations you have, because here actually companies within the same industries, competitors, companies with their investors, like everybody wants to ultimately team up across industry boundaries and solve this challenge. And that, I think, to me, is a signal the train has ultimately now finally left the station, and we just want to go into the right direction to ultimately act against climate risks and get it done.
So everybody needs to get on board. Thank you very much for that. And I'm going to thank you all for your contributions, which I think have been terrific. And, I hope very much there have been a lot of government policymakers who have been tuning into this, and companies and investors and the whole spectrum of stakeholders. So thank you again to the panel for your contributions. I'm going to ask you, the audience, to stay tuned, as there will be another session which will be along shortly. But thank you for your time for listening in to us. Bye-bye.